All right, welcome to the second lesson. We're going to divide integers. The next lesson is going to be order of operations, where we will, guess what, multiply and divide integers. So today, again, we have no vocabulary. Remember, integers just means positive or negative whole numbers. And today we'll be able to divide two or more integers. So we're going to rewrite these following division problems as multiplication to help evaluate the problem. So in this one, I have 15 divided by 5. What that means is I'm looking for 5 times what number equals 15. Okay? So this is a positive, and I need to think a positive times what equals a positive. So I know, first I'm going to think of my numbers. 5 times 3 is 15, and if I didn't know that, I can use my multiplication chart and find 15, or not find 15, find 5, and find when does it equal 15. Oh, right there, and I go over, and that's 3. Okay? And a positive times a positive is that positive. So my answer is 3. Okay, so number 2, this is another way to show division is by using a fraction sign. We're kind of using that fraction notation. So again, in this one, I'm going to start with that dividing by. It's 16 divided by negative 2. So I'm going to think negative 2 times what number is 16. So first I'm just going to think 2 times what is 16. If I don't know, I can grab my multiplication chart, go to 2, drop down to 16, and I get 8. Because it's 16 is 8. So 2 times 8 is 16. Oh, that's weird, 8. Okay, and here I have a negative times what is a positive. And it'd be a negative times a negative. So my answer has to be a negative 8. Okay, next one I have negative 20 divided by 4. So I'm going to take that, what we're dividing by, 4. And I think 4 times what is negative 20, because really it's backwards multiplication. Okay, so 4 times, if we don't know, we use our chart, go down to 20, and we get 5. So 4 times 5 is 20. But if I just do positive times a positive, I don't get a negative. A positive times a positive is a positive. And it has to be negative. So this would have to be negative 5. Because a positive times a negative equals a negative. So my answer is going to be negative 5. Okay, lastly I have negative 60 divided by negative 10. So for multiplication I take the divisor here, negative 10 times what is the dividend, negative 60. So I'm thinking 10 times what is 60? So 10 times 6. So I went from 10 down to 60 and then over to find 6. Now I have to think, does a negative times a positive equal a negative? And the answer is yes, because remember, if I have negative 10 groups of 6, that means I'm going to be subtracting 6 10 times. And that'll give me negative. Okay? So now let's think about the quotient. So the quotient means to divide. So when we divide a positive and a positive, or the quotient of a positive and a positive, so positive divided by a positive, when we go back to this original equation, I get a positive number. So that's positive divided by positive equals a positive. Okay, the quotient of a positive number, so we have the positive number divided by a negative number, and we ended up with a negative. Because in order for it to work, as backwards multiplication, we do negative times a negative is a positive. So negative, oops, sorry, we started with a positive. This is this one, sorry, divided by negative equals a negative. Okay, in this one, the quotient of a negative number, we started with a negative, and we divided by a positive. We ended up with a negative, because for that backwards multiplication to work, positive times a negative is a negative, and so this had to be a negative. So our quotient should be a negative number. So a negative divided by a positive equals a negative. Okay, and lastly, the quotient of a negative and a negative. So when I did a negative divided by a negative, my answer was a positive 6, because a negative times a positive has to equal a negative. So my answer should end up being positive, because a negative divided by a negative equals a positive. Okay, so evaluate the following expressions. So the first thing that we always do is we're actually just going to divide the numbers. So 45 divided by 9. That's what we're going to think first. Okay, so 45 divided by 9. If I don't know that answer, I use my multiplication chart. I go to 9, drop down to 45. It's right here. Scoot over, and I get 5. So that equals 5. But I don't know if it, and then I'm going to think, is it positive or negative? Okay, and to think about that, we think that this is a positive divided by a negative. And in order for this to work, I have to think, does 5 times negative 9 equal 45? And I kind of think about it as backwards multiplication. It's 5 times negative 9. So a positive times a negative would equal a negative. So this has to be a negative. So negative 5. Okay, so B, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually do 32 divided by 4. Again, if we don't know that, we use our multiplication chart. I go to 4, because that's what I'm dividing by. Go down to 32, scoot over to 8. So this equals 8, and I'm not sure if it's positive or negative, so I'm going to rewrite it as that, using that division sign. So negative 32 divided by negative 4. So I'm going to think backwards multiplication to make it work. Does 8 times negative 4 equal negative 32? So positive times a negative. Positive times a negative is a negative. So we do get a positive here. Oh, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Negative divided by negative did equal positive. Okay, so for C, we're going to just think about 56 divided by 8, and then we just kind of think of backwards multiplication. Okay, so whoops, sorry, you probably can't see that. So I go to 8, drop down to 56, there it is, just go over, I get 7. And now I think backwards multiplication. So if I take 7 times 8, does it equal 56? Well, 7 times 8 would be a positive times a positive, and that gives us a positive. So this will have to be a negative 7. Okay, so a negative divided by a positive equals a negative. Okay, now it kind of gave us a tricky one. There's 2 division signs here. So remember, we divide left to right. Okay, so I'm going to start with 80 divided by negative 4, because I'm going to go left to right. So I'm going to start with 80 divided by 4. I think of just the numbers first. So I go to 4, I drop down to 80, which is way at the bottom, and that's 20. Okay, and I have a positive divided by a negative. So again, I can think backwards. Does 20 times negative 4 equal 80? And the answer is yes. Positive divided by a negative is negative. So I have 20 divided by 5 now. No, it has to be a negative. Negative times a negative is a positive. There we go. Okay, so negative 20 divided by 5. So I'm going to go to 5. I drop down to 20, and I get 4. Again, I want to think backwards multiplication. So does 4 times 5 equal negative 20? Well, 4 times 5 would give us 20. So this has to be negative to give us that negative 20. Or we can think a negative divided by a positive is a negative. All right, so when dividing a positive by a negative, or a negative by a positive, because this is the new stuff, we haven't done this yet, we get a negative. And when dividing a negative by a negative, we get a positive. All right, and that is it for lesson 2.